Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here, and today I'm playing around with an idea that I had to try to create a sort of impressionistic misty ravine scene with a couple of trees just sort of clinging onto a rock face. So I hope you'll enjoy joining me for another experimental studio vlog where I play around with ideas and just have fun playing with paint. I'm not trying to create a finished painting, I'm just exploring ideas. But first, just to let you know that my new book, Landscapes in Watercolour, is available to purchase from all good online bookstores in the UK and available to pre-order in most places around the world. So check out the links below. Today I've decided to deviate from my normal landscape format to portrait format, which is a little bit harder to film, but I hope that you will bear with me. But what it does do, it allows room on my drawing board or painting board for me to show you the mixing of my colour palette. So hopefully you'll find that interesting to watch how I mix my colours when I'm playing around with paint like this. So the first thing to do is to sketch out the scene. I've looked at a few reference photographs online, and that sort of helped me to bring together a few ideas of my own inspired by the photographs that I've seen. And I'm looking to get a sort of foreground sheer rock face with a couple of trees growing out of it near the base, and then a misty mountain in the background. I want the foreground rock to be mostly in deep shadow so that the trees and the misty mountain are the focus. I'm using an ordinary DIY carpenter's pencil. It's got a nice chunky lead. I'm holding it halfway down and it's keeping me nice and loose. I've sped up the painting process a little bit for you because when I'm experimenting, there's a lot of stopping and starting and thinking as I make decisions or think about what I'm going to do next and how I'm going to try and achieve what I have in my mind. So here's my setup. I'm using, should be clean water, looks like it's got a little bit of paint in it, but clean water or the equivalent of that to wet my page all over because I'll be working with the wet in wet method. On my palette from left to right, I've got indigo, Payne's grey, and then I've got some burnt umber. So I'm looking for a sort of a very greyish but sort of warmish grey sky, which is why I've added a bit of the burnt umber into my indigo and Payne's grey. Mixing it up into a fairly sort of medium value colour. Now that's a bit of burnt sienna because I decided I wanted to sort of warm it up even more. My page is wet, so I don't need a really watery mix of paint, otherwise it'll just get washed out. So I'm checking my colour and I think I've got the grey that I want. Remember, paint always goes on much darker when you're painting with watercolour, particularly the wet in wet method. This will lighten up substantially. And now I'm looking just for a very simple graduated wash with this grey, getting slightly lighter down towards the bottom. Horizontal brush strokes. The brush I'm using is my 1.5 inch Mottler. It's a Princeton Aqua Elite. You could use a Harky brush for this or a large flat brush. Any brush that you're comfortable with. And now this is a much richer, drier mix of indigo and Payne's grey, and while the page is still quite wet, I'm using this drier mix to put in my distant mountain, which will softly diffuse because, of course, the page is wet. I'm following my pencil guideline. And now I've squeezed out some sap green. It's a pre-mixed green, which is quite handy for experimenting. You don't have to sort of worry about trying to mix up the perfect green. I'm just looking for a nice mid-green, and we get that with sap green, because sap green is a mixture of ultramarine blue and cad yellow, I think. I'm just dropping in where I'm going to have my foliage and where I've got some sort of grasses and plants below the trees. This is my underpainting, so everything's softening and diffusing. I can bring it together with some sharper, harder marks later on. But for now, I'm looking for soft transitions and just the indications of where all my features are. It's very important that I keep using a slightly drier mix than the mixes that I use to put in the background wash, because I don't want to cause any cauliflowers or runbacks. Now this is a really rich mixture of colour, not quite tube consistency, but not much water added to it. And I'm quickly dragging in very loosely my steep rocky ravine shapes, dipping back into the green, maybe a bit of sort of the brown as well, and building up these base shapes and tones and hues. You see I'm putting a little bit of my burnt sienna into the green, warming it up in places, but I don't want too much of that, just a little bit of that down near the ground, I think. I want to make sure that I get a soft transition for my darkest shadows, but then I can bring those together with harder marks and firmer brush strokes later. My base layer is nearly ready, so I'm going to now introduce some deliberate little blooms or cauliflower marks. I'm using a piece of old paper to cover over my sky. This protects it from the clean water droplets I'm flicking into the ravine and the rocks and the foliage, because I don't want any of those marks in my sky. And hopefully you can see how those water droplets have given me some lovely textural effects. Now I'm going to drag some tree trunks and branches, loosely following my pencil lines where I penciled in the trees, using the tip of my palette knife. I'm scraping through the rich paint. Where it's drying off, I'm getting light marks. Where the paper is still quite wet, I'm getting darker marks where the paint is filling in the little scratch that I'm making with the tip of my palette knife. I don't mind either. I'm just looking for shapes and highlights here at this stage. Now that I've almost finished this first layer, I'm going to lay my board flat so that the washes don't run anymore. This is ordinary table salt, and my paint is almost dry in the foreground, but I'm going to sprinkle a little tiny bit, not much, just a few grains here and there of the salt across the foreground, and hopefully that should just paint the foreground leaves and grasses on the ground for me. Once I've sprinkled that in, I can leave it to dry. So here's the dry painting. I've raised it back up to my 20-degree angle. If you look at the top, you can see there's a little bit of buckling of the paper still, but it's not quite fully dry, even though it's dry enough to paint on. You can see the salt effects are looking really pretty. I've brushed off any spare salt that wasn't dissolved on the page with a clean brush. And now I'm just working with some of the colours that I've got here and my flat brush to define the ravine and the rocks a bit more. I'm starting off with a mid value, just getting a harder edge. Then I'll bring in some darker colours and lighter colours where I think the painting needs it, and then sort of try and create texture on the rocks without distracting too much from the trees and the foliage as they grow out against the distant mountain and the paler sky. I'm using my palette knife to put a bit of texture into the darkest parts of the ravine rock face. Adding some burnt umber into my Payne's Grey and Indigo mixture, nice and dark, and using my number 2 rigger brush, I'll begin to paint in the dark branches and tree trunks. I've almost finished. I can't quite decide whether I want to leave these as bare branches or whether I want to put some foliage in. So I've removed the tape so that I can see the painting with fresh eyes. I'm looking at it, and I think for this experiment I'm going to try to use some calligraphic brush strokes to create the foliage, working in and around the branches. I don't want to obscure the branches too much, but I think because I've got such beautiful salt effects on the ground, sort of in the foreground, I want to just create some foliage that complements that. And for that I'm going to use sap green, indigo and Payne's Grey, maybe a little bit of the burnt umber, and my small calligraphy brush, and just do these sort of dancing calligraphic brush strokes, little dots around the edges, and carefully work over both trees, providing them with some foliage. I shall try to make sure that I keep the foliage mostly a little bit lighter towards the tops of the trees and introduce some of the indigo to the sap green around the base of the little groups and clusters of leaves. This hopefully will help to give me a little bit of suggested shape and form to these trees. So just a few more little darks in and around the tree trunks, maybe just a few little sticks and twigs here and there, a few extra branches to balance things out. But I'm not going to get too carried away here. This is, after all, just an experiment. And I'm quite happy with the way that this has turned out. It's kind of going in the direction that I wanted it to, that I have in my mind. I've got a sort of vision of how I'd like a scene like this to look. And while this isn't that at all, it's on the way, and it's closer than I was before I started painting, if you see what I mean. I like this colour palette as a starting point. I like the composition. I'm not sure about the balance of values. I think there's too much dark over on the right near the top in that rock face. That needs to be broken up a little bit more. But I'm really pleased with the way this experiment is shaping up. So if you have some ideas of things that you'd like to paint, don't be afraid to forge in and get it wrong first time, second time, third time. It's the only way that you'll learn is by having a go, getting it wrong, analysing what went wrong, trying to correct the mistake in the next attempt. So that's how we learn. We will never get to the finished results that we want without all that trial and error beforehand. So if you've got some ideas, just go for it and celebrate the fact if things go wrong, because that means you're well on the way to finding out how to get it right. So I hope you found that helpful to see how I go about experimenting with a new idea and how I'm prepared to get things wrong in order to move forward and hopefully get things right next time. Please leave us a thumbs up, and also if you're new here, it would be wonderful if you could subscribe to our channel. It really helps with our reach. And thank you so much to everybody that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. Many thanks, take care, and happy painting. Bye.